January 1945. A thin layer of frost clings to a shattered Luftwaffe airfield somewhere outside Munich. The war is burning itself out, but the sky above Germany is louder, faster, and deadlier than ever. A mechanic wipes oil from his numb fingers as he pulls the chocks from beneath a strange, predatory shape. The Me-262's twin Junkers jets cough, spit, then rise into a feral howl that vibrates through the concrete. The scent of kerosene mixes with cold metal and distant artillery. Across the field, another aircraft waits under the weak winter sun. The Dornier Do 335 file. Its twin inline engines arranged in a push-pull layout that seems almost impossible. A piston fighter built to outrun time itself. Above them, the rumble of Allied bombers grows steadily. B-17s, B-24s. Their contrails stretch like white scars across the morning sky dot, and in this frozen moment, between jet, rocket, and the last evolution of the piston engine, one question hangs heavier than the winter air. Which Warbird was truly the fastest of the Second World War? And who deserved the crown of speed? The answer begins long before these engines ever roared to life. Speed did not begin as a weapon. In the years after the First World War, it was a sport, a fascination, a proving ground for nations dreaming of mechanical supremacy. The 1920s and 1930s became an age of aerodynamic daring, where polished metal, streamlined fuselages, and racing trophies hinted at a new frontier in aviation. Across Europe and America, engineers chased speed not with guns, but with stopwatches. The Schneider Trophy races pushed pilots and machines to the edge, carving the foundations of what would soon become the fighter aircraft of a new kind of war. Britain's supermarine engineers refined the sleek lines that would later shape the Spitfire. Germany's designers, no longer bound by the restrictions of the defeated Reich, explored monoplane forms, metal skins, and fuel-efficient inline engines. America's air racers broke records over desert airfields, scouting the future in bright paint and bare aluminum. Yet beneath the glory, the world was shifting. By the early 1930s, the idea of speed was no longer poetic. It was strategic, military. Planners realized a simple truth: the faster aircraft could climb, intercept, or evade, the thinner the margin between survival and destruction. Speed meant initiative, the ability to decide when to strike, when to disengage, and when to escape with a few centimeters of fuel left in the tank. Governments took notice. Budgets grew. Factories turned toward a new era of all-metal monoplane fighters. Germany introduced the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the first of its kind to combine lightweight, high power, and aerodynamic purity. With a top speed approaching 350 miles per hour in the mid-1930s, it rewrote expectations of what a single-seat fighter could achieve. Britain responded with the Hurricane and the Spitfire, each building on lessons from those early racing days. The concept of the 400 miles per hour fighter, once a dream, began to creep into engineering conversations. It became clear that the next war, if it came, would be decided not only by armies and navies, but by machines that could touch the upper limits of air. But speed had a natural enemy: physics. Every nation confronted the same walls: propeller efficiency dropping near high velocities, engines overheating under combat power, airframes trembling under compressibility effects. That invisible barrier, near 500 miles per hour, became the new frontier of terror and temptation. Still, engineers kept pushing. By the late 1930s, Germany was already imagining engines with no pistons at all. Early jet designs scratched onto paper, centrifugal compressors tested in secret facilities. The thought of a warplane with no propeller, streaking across the sky faster than any pilot could comprehend, seemed almost unbelievable. But the political landscape was darkening. Europe teetered. Border tensions sharpened. And by September 1939, the quiet race for speed exploded into a brutal contest for survival. when German forces swept into Poland, the world saw how fast the Luftwaffe's fighters could strike and retreat. The Bf-109E dominated early engagements with its quick climb and sharp dives, its speed giving German pilots the upper hand. But just across the Channel, Britain's Royal Air Force held machines born from the same philosophy, the Spitfire, with its elliptical wings and powerful Merlin engine, matched the German fighter blow for blow. During the Battle of Britain, hundreds of young pilots learned firsthand what speed truly meant, the difference between catching a bomber before it reached London, or watching it disappear into cloud cover with bombs already falling. Yet even as these piston fighters clashed over the English coast, a second race continued in laboratories and test facilities. Engineers on both sides began asking dangerous questions. How much more speed could they squeeze out of a propeller-driven aircraft? How far could engines be pushed before they tore themselves apart? And what new kinds of propulsion could shatter the limits of propeller-driven flight? Deep inside Germany, the first experimental jet engines took form. Junkers and BMW worked through the night, building prototypes that hissed, sputtered, and sometimes exploded. But each failure revealed another piece of the puzzle. The Me-262, still just a concept, promised speeds no piston aircraft could dream of. At the same time, radical ideas like the rocket-powered interceptor were whispered among Luftwaffe strategists. Meanwhile, Allied designers refined their own machines. America's aviation industry, vast and awakening, was preparing fighters that would later push into the 430 miles per hour range. The Pacific War was drawing closer, and naval aviation demanded aircraft with raw speed to match Japan's maneuverable fighters. All this momentum, all this innovation, pointed to one truth: speed was no longer a luxury. It had become a weapon of national survival. And as the pressure of war mounted, the pursuit intensified. Engineers worked through nights lit by factory lamps. Test pilots risked their lives on every flight, pushing prototypes to the edge of structural failure. Each nation began to believe that if they could build the fastest aircraft in the world, they might bend the war's trajectory in their favor. But the faster the machines became, the more obvious the costs. Engines wore out faster, airframes strained under stress, and pilots found that the sky was becoming a place where decisions had to be made in fractions of seconds. The world was entering a new age of aviation, one where speed itself was becoming a battlefield. And that battlefield was about to expand. By 1940, the world understood that air superiority would shape the outcome of the war, but few realized just how dramatically the race for speed was about to shift. The Battle of Britain had proven that carefully engineered piston fighters could decide the fate of nations. Yet behind the smoke trails and dogfights, engineers were quietly discovering the limits of propeller-driven flight, limits that would soon force every major power to rethink what a fighter aircraft could be. As the Luftwaffe pushed deeper into Europe and North Africa, the Bf-109 continued to evolve. Its Daimler-Benz engines grew stronger, its airframe more refined, its speed inching toward the edge of what a piston machine could sustain in combat. At the same time, Britain refined the Spitfire into faster and higher climbing variants, each iteration shaving seconds off climb times and adding precious miles per hour to its top speed. But while early war piston fighters battled ferociously, the strategic demands of the conflict were changing. The skies were becoming more crowded. Bombers flew higher and deeper into enemy territory. Escort fighters needed greater range. Interceptors needed faster climbs. Engineers searched for breakthroughs, two-stage superchargers, improved propellers, sleeker airframes, and increasingly powerful engines that pushed mechanics to their limits. Still, no matter how much they improved, one truth became clearer each year: pistons alone would not win the battle for ultimate speed. Germany recognized this earlier than most. In hidden workshops across Augsburg and Berlin, Men like Hans von Ohain and teams at Junkers and BMW were developing something astonishing. Engines that burned fuel continuously, producing thrust without pistons, propellers, or complex mechanical gearing. Jet propulsion was no longer a theory. It was becoming a machine capable of rewriting the rules of aerial warfare. But the jet age was not born easily. Early engines overheated, vibrated violently, and sometimes disintegrated mid-test. Turbine blades melted. Compressors stalled. Metallurgy lagged behind ambition. And the war placed unbearable pressure on development timelines. Yet the work pressed on. By 1942, prototypes of what would become the Messerschmitt Me 262 were flying, first with piston engines mounted awkwardly on the nose, then with the revolutionary Junkers Jumo 004 jets slung under the wings. When the aircraft finally accelerated under pure jet power, test pilots described something almost unreal, a smooth, relentless push forward. Free from the grinding vibration of pistons and propellers, the age of the jet fighter had arrived. Even if most of the world did not yet know it, but Germany was not alone in pressing into new aerodynamic frontiers. In the United States, factories scaled up to a level the world had never seen. With industrial might backing them, American designers produced fighters that pushed piston technology to its peak: the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning, and the long-legged P-51 Mustang. Each iteration grew faster, sleeker, and more capable of operating across the vast distances of the European and Pacific theaters. Meanwhile, Japan worked to develop faster interceptors to defend against the growing threat of American bombing raids. The desperate need to intercept B-29 superfortresses at high altitude spurred rapid innovation. But resource shortages and late war chaos slowed their progress. Britain, aware of Germany's jet experiments, accelerated its own secret project, the Gloucester Meteor, a pioneering jet fighter that would eventually patrol British skies, though it never fought its German counterpart directly. But the most extreme attempt to break into the future of speed came from inside Germany itself, the rocket-powered interceptor. Unlike jets, rocket engines delivered terrifying bursts of acceleration and speed at the cost of endurance, safety, and practicality. The Messerschmitt Me 163 Comet was the embodiment of this idea, a point defense rocket climbing almost vertically to speeds no piston or early jet could match. But its fuel was catastrophically volatile, and its flight window lasted mere minutes. It was a technological leap far beyond its time, and far too dangerous for the world that built it. As 1943 turned into 1944, the race for speed was no longer theoretical. It had become a brutal necessity. Allied bombers were raining destruction on German cities and factories. The Luftwaffe, battered and shrinking, needed fighters that could strike quickly and escape before escort fighters could react. Jet and rocket designs were no longer experimental curiosities. They were becoming the last hopes of a collapsing regime. At the same time, the Allies understood that speed alone would not win the war. Reliability, range, manufacturability, and tactical integration mattered as much as raw performance. Their piston fighters, now refined to near perfection, continued to dominate through consistent numbers and proven engineering. Still, the question could no longer be avoided. If the war demanded the fastest fighters ever built, which aircraft truly pushed the boundaries of what was possible? Because now the contenders were emerging, machines powered by pistons, jets, and even rockets. Machines that would redefine combat. Machines that would change aviation forever. And the clash between them was approaching its peak. Speed is a simple word, but in the skies of the Second World War, it carried many meanings. To understand who truly deserved the crown of fastest, we must examine the contenders, not only by their top speeds, but by the realities of how they flew, how they fought, and what they cost the men who piloted them. Here, The first three angles focus on the machines themselves: rocket, jet, and piston. Three different paths toward the same goal. Angle 1. The Me-163. Comet, the terrifying rocket menace, approximately equals 250 to 300 words. Imagine a fighter that didn't climb, it launched. That was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the world's first operational rocket-powered aircraft. It was not designed to patrol, escort, or duel. It existed for one purpose: to reach Allied bombers faster than anything else ever built. When its volatile rocket engine ignited, the Comet surged forward with a force that shocked even its test pilots. It climbed almost vertically, streaking upward at acceleration rates that no other fighter of the era could match. In level flight, it could exceed 590 miles per hour, briefly, making it the fastest aircraft in the world. Yet the speed came at a cost measured in danger rather than fuel. The rocket mixture, a combination of hypergolic chemicals, ignited on contact and could dissolve skin on touch. Ground crews wore protective rubber suits while fueling it, knowing that a single mistake could be fatal. Once airborne, the Comet had only a few minutes of powered flight before it became a glider. Pilots had one chance, one pass through a bomber formation, before they lost speed and drifted back to Earth, vulnerable to fighters waiting above the landing strip. Many Comets were destroyed not in combat, but during landings when their skid-based undercarriage slammed into the ground with no second chance. The Me-163 was undoubtedly fast, faster than anything in the air at the time. But speed alone did not make it a king. Its danger, fragility, and narrow tactical worth meant it was feared, admired, but never crowned. Angle 2. The Me-262 Schwalbe, the jet that changed the future. 250 to 300 words. If the Comet was a rocket in search of a purpose, the Me-262 was the first true glimpse of tomorrow. This was the world's first operational jet fighter, a machine that, unlike the Comet, was not a desperate experiment, but a fully capable combat aircraft far ahead of its time. At over 540 miles per hour, the Me-262 outpaced every Allied fighter in level flight. Pilots described its acceleration as smooth and relentless, a kind of thrust unknown to piston engines. It could strike a bomber formation, fire its heavy cannon, and disengage before escorts could react. It swept wing roots, tricycle landing gear, and twin Jumo 04 jets gave it a silhouette that barely resembled its contemporaries. It was a blueprint for what the next century of fighter aircraft would become, yet it arrived too late, and into a world collapsing around it. The engines were fragile, often lasting only 20 to 25 flight hours before catastrophic wear. Germany lacked high-temperature alloys needed to build turbines that could withstand long service. Fuel shortages limited pilot training, and Allied fighters soon learned to attack Me-262s during their most vulnerable moments, takeoff and landing, when their jets spooled slowly and offered no protection. Still, the Me-262 fought. It shot down bombers, startled escorts, and left countless aircrews stunned by its sheer velocity. More importantly, unlike the Comet, it proved that jet speed could survive in combat. If speed was a lineage, the Me-262 was its first true kingmaker. Angle 3. The Dornier Do 335. The piston powerhouse, approximately equals 250 to 300 words. Amid these radical propulsion breakthroughs, there was one piston aircraft that pushed the old world to its absolute edge, the Dornier Do 335. It wasn't a jet. It wasn't a rocket. Yet it was faster than every conventional propeller-driven fighter of the war, and some jets struggled to match its dive performance. What made the Do 335 extraordinary was its unique push-pull engine layout. One engine in those pulled. A second engine, buried within the tail, pushed. This eliminated the aerodynamic drag of twin-boom designs, giving the Do-335 astonishing straight-line speed, around 474 miles per hour in level flight. For a piston aircraft in 1944-45, this was unprecedented. Its acceleration was superb, and its climb rate rivaled early jets. Allied test pilots who flew captured Do-335s later described it as surprisingly stable, responsive, and ahead of its time. Yet like the Me-262, the file suffered from timing. Germany's collapsing industry could not produce it in numbers. Many airfields were bombed before deliveries began. It entered service in tiny quantities, barely enough to leave a mark on the battlefield. Still, the Do-335 stands as the final, towering pinnacle of piston engine speed, a reminder that even without jets or rockets, engineers could stretch propeller-driven design into realms once thought impossible. The contenders were set. 3 machines, rocket, jet, and piston, each commanding their own kind of speed. But raw performance was only part of the story. Raw speed creates legends, but real supremacy in the sky is shaped by forces far larger than numbers printed in test reports. To understand who truly deserves the crown, we must examine speed from the human perspective, the tactical perspective, and the strategic one. Because the fastest aircraft is not always the deadliest, nor the most useful. Angle 4, the pilot's perspective. Speed as survival, 250 to 300 words, for the men strapped inside these machines. Speed was not a statistic, it was a lifeline. Pilots flying over Germany in 1944 and 1945 described the Me-262 not as an aircraft but as a silver blur. Allied fighters could barely turn to intercept before it was gone. The moment a jet streaked past a Mustang or Thunderbolt, pilots faced a simple truth. They couldn't catch it in level flight. German pilots experienced something entirely different. For them, speed brought responsibility and fear in equal measure. In aircraft like the Me-262 or Do-335, closing speeds during combat were so high that gun passes lasted only seconds. A pilot had to judge angles, distance, and fire control solutions with almost zero margin for error. Rocket pilots had it even worse. An Me-163 pilot had only a few minutes of powered flight, during which decisions came at blistering velocity. Overshooting a bomber meant the opportunity was gone. Misjudging a landing meant death. Many pilots described the Comet not as a fighter, but as a controlled fall through the sky. Speed allowed escape, but it also demanded precision. A pilot who failed to master the rapid tempo of high speed combat could lose control faster than his engine could accelerate. Thus, from the cockpit, speed was never absolute. It was a blessing and a burden. Angle 5, tactical reality. Fast enough to fight or only to flee. Approximately equals 250 to 300 words. In war, speed is only useful if it serves a purpose. And tactically, the fastest aircraft were often limited by their own brilliance. The Me-163, for example, could outrun everything, but it could not stay in the fight. Its rocket burned out so quickly that pilots had only a single attack run before transforming into gliders. Strategically, this made it an interceptor with a knife-like purpose, but no flexibility. The Me-262 was more capable, but still carried a complex tactical profile. Its jet engines offered tremendous top speed, but poor throttle response. A sudden push of power at low altitude could destroy the engine. Tight turns starved the turbines, and slow acceleration at low speed made the aircraft vulnerable during takeoffs and landings. Moments Allied fighter pilots exploited relentlessly. Piston fighters like the Do-335 had better agility and reliability, but lacked the overwhelming acceleration of jets and rockets. Their speed made them superb interceptors, Yet they still operated within the boundaries of propeller-driven aerodynamics. Real tactical speed is not just top speed. It's acceleration, climb rate, dive speed, energy retention, and the ability to fight after the first pass. And in those areas, some slower aircraft, like the P-51 Mustang or late war Spitfires, often outperformed the faster, more experimental designs and actual dogfights. Thus, the tactical king of speed was not the fastest machine, but the one that could remain deadly after the initial burst. Angle 6, Logistics and Numbers. A king without a kingdom? Approximately equals 250 to 300 words. Speed in wartime is meaningless if the aircraft cannot fly, and this is where the gulf between concept and reality becomes most striking. The rocket-powered Mi-163 was terrifyingly fast, but its fuels were so dangerous and limited that only small numbers ever took to the sky. Many were destroyed in ground explosions. Its combat impact, statistically, was negligible. The Mi-262, although revolutionary, suffered from logistical fragility. Germany lacked the advanced metals required for durable jet turbines. Engines failed often. Spare parts were scarce. Fuel was vanishing. Skilled pilots were even scarcer. The Do-335, despite its impressive performance, was built in such tiny quantities that it barely entered operational service before the war collapsed. It was a technological marvel trapped inside a shrinking industrial shell. Meanwhile, slower Allied aircraft, Mustangs, Tempests, Spitfires, Thunderbolts, filled the sky in overwhelming numbers. They could be repaired, fueled, and flown day after day. Their engines ran reliably. Their pilots were well trained. In the end, the war was not won by the fastest plane, but by the aircraft that could fight consistently. Logistics crowned the real kings of the air. A fighter that cannot be produced in numbers, maintained easily, or flown by trained pilots is not a ruler. It is a footnote. And so the question sharpens. If speed alone could not dominate, then where was the true turning point? By late 1944, the war in Europe had reached a boiling point. The Allies controlled the air by sheer weight of numbers. But Germany still possessed one final weapon that no pilot on the other side of the channel could ignore. Speed unlike anything the world had ever seen. The moment of reckoning arrived, high above the industrial heartland of Germany, where bomber formations began to encounter enemies that seemed to defy the laws of flight. When jets met the bombers, it began with distant specks, tiny glints of sunlight off metal, approaching at angles that defied the familiar geometry of a dogfight. A B-17 gunner, staring through the narrow slit of his turret, might have had seconds to realize the truth. We're being attacked by jets. On the morning of the 18th of March, 1945, during a deep strike against Berlin, the U.S. 8th Air Force sent more than 1,000 bombers toward the capital. Above them, layers of P-51 and P-47 fighters circled, forming a moving fortress of aluminum and firepower. But from the west, a small formation of Mi-262s rose from Lechfeld and Neuburg airfields. Their pilots knew they could not stop the bombers alone. Germany no longer possessed the numbers or the fuel, but they also knew that their aircraft offered one remaining advantage: speed so great that even the best Allied fighters could barely react. As the jets closed in, the bomber crews watched something they'd never seen before. The Mi-262 didn't weave, didn't climb, didn't dive. It simply appeared, a silver flash sidestepping the escort fighters like they were standing still. Its pilots, trained to make high-speed passes, opened fire with 430mm Mk108 cannons, shells so powerful that a single hit could tear the wing off a bomber. Entire formations shook as the jets slashed through at over 500 miles per hour, firing bursts that lasted only fractions of a second. In one pass, a Mi-262 could do what a Bf-109 needed a minute to attempt. But the speed that made the jet deadly also made its attacks unstable. Closing speeds between and me, 262 and a B-17 often exceeded 800 miles per hour. German pilots had milliseconds to judge range and lead. Many fired too early or too late. Gun film from that day shows cannon bursts tracing wide arcs ahead or behind their targets. The pilots simply couldn't adjust fast enough. Still, the effect on the bomber crews was electric. A tail gunner on a B-24 later wrote, "It was like being passed by a comet. There was no sound until it was gone." The Allies responded with tactics of their own. Because they couldn't chase the Me-262 in the air, they hunted it on the ground. Mustangs orbited German airfields at low altitude, waiting for jets to take off or land when their engines were slow to spool and their airspeed too low to escape. These ambushes took a brutal toll. A large portion of Me-262 losses occurred not in high-speed combat, but on approach or departure, moments when even the world's fastest fighter became helpless. Still, when the jets did engage properly, their presence fractured the rhythm of the air war. Bomber formations that once held together under fighter escort now found themselves exposed for critical seconds as the 262s streaked through their ranks. Escort fighters scrambled to reposition, turning wide arcs that could never match the jet's straight-line dash. For a moment, a brief, flickering moment, it seemed as if Germany had regained the initiative in the air. Pilots returned from mission debriefings with stories of bombers destroyed in a single pass, of Allied formations scattering under the shock of jet attacks, of a future in which piston engines were simply obsolete. But war is not won by flashes of brilliance. And the Me-262, for all its speed, arrived too late and in too few numbers to stem the tide. By the spring of 1945, Allied bombing pressure intensified. The Luftwaffe's supply lines collapsed. Jet fuel and trained pilots became rarities. Entire airfields were destroyed before the jets could even taxi, and yet, in those closing months, the world witnessed something unforgettable, the first true clash between yesterday's machines and tomorrow's. It was the moment when speed ceased to be just a number and became the axis on which the future of aerial warfare turned. But Germany had one more extreme weapon of speed, one even faster, more dangerous, and more desperate. A weapon that could outclimb and outrun anything ever built during the war. And yet could not change its outcome. Speed was becoming a final act of defiance. As Germany's cities burned and its armies retreated, the Luftwaffe turned to machines so advanced and so dangerous that even their own pilots questioned whether they were weapons. Our last gambles carved from desperation, among them was the fastest aircraft ever to see combat in the Second World War. A machine that didn't fly toward the enemy. It ascended like a missile. The last throw. Experimental speed versus a collapsing Reich in the final months of the war. American bomber crews reported a new kind of interceptor rising beneath them. It appeared suddenly, climbing at an angle no propeller aircraft could match. For a moment, its silhouette seemed unreal, almost alien. Then it vanished upward, trailing a burning plume. This was the Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, the only operational rocket-powered fighter in history. It was the single fastest aircraft to take part in combat during World War II, and yet, it was also one of the least effective. A burst of unmatched speed, the Comet's engine produced terrifying acceleration. From takeoff, it could reach 30,000 feet in under 3 minutes, faster than any Allied fighter could hope to follow. In level flight, it exceeded 590 miles per hour, the edge of what 1940s aerodynamics could handle. American pilots watching it rise described it as a firework with wings. And for the first time, bombers traveling in formation felt genuinely exposed. A Comet could slash through them too quickly for turret gunners to track. But the rocket engine that gave it such power also doomed it. The volatile fuel mixture, T-Stoff and C-Stoff, ignited on contact. A minor leak could dissolve metal, bone, or anything else nearby. Ground crews worked in heavy rubber suits. Fueling accidents were common and brutal. Even a perfect takeoff meant only minutes of powered flight before the aircraft became little more than a glider drifting back toward its airfield. One shot at victory, the tactical reality was crushing. To hit a bomber, a Comet pilot had to fire within a 1 or 2 second window, adjusting aim at closing speeds approaching 900 miles per hour. Many pilots overshot their targets entirely. Those who survived the attack then faced the most dangerous part of the mission, landing. With its fuel gone, the aircraft descended silently toward the ground. Allied fighters waited above its home airfields, picking off comets as they settled onto their skid-based landing gear. Many others simply crashed on touchdown due to the unforgiving landing profile. The world's fastest Warbird had become a symbol of futility, speed without endurance, innovation without strategy. The last piston titan arrives, while jets and rockets battled overhead. Another contender emerged, one that pushed piston technology to its absolute limit. In late 1944, the Luftwaffe received the first few Dornier Do 335 file fighters. To Allied intelligence, reports of a twin-engine single-fuselage aircraft sounded improbable. But when Allied test pilots later flew captured examples, they discovered something astonishing. The Do 335 could reach 474 miles per hour in level flight, faster than any other piston fighter of the war. It climbed rapidly, dived even faster, and handled like a fighter far lighter than its size suggested. Unlike the Me-163 or Me-262, it's stable, practical, and reliable. Its push-pull design delivered speed without the drag penalties that plagued traditional twin-engine aircraft. In a different war, or produced just a year earlier, the Do 335 might have rewritten air combat doctrine. But time was something. Germany no longer possessed. By early 1945, factories were rubble. Fuel was scarce. Pilots were untrained. The file arrived as a masterpiece unveiled to an empty theater. Its speed was unrivaled in the piston world, yet it had no chance to prove itself in meaningful combat. Speed meets reality together. These machines, the Me-163, Me-262, and Do 335, represented the final, desperate acceleration of German aeronautical engineering. The Reich was collapsing, but its designers were pushing into the future at a pace seen nowhere else on Earth. Yet speed alone could not change the war. A handful of jets and rocket interceptors could not counter thousands of Allied fighters and bombers. Fuel limitations grounded aircraft. Engine failures destroyed others. Airfields were bombed before planes could take off. Even the fastest technologies ever conceived were powerless against the weight of a global war already decided by numbers, logistics, and territory. And so, in the spring of 1945, as Allied troops closed in from east and west, the Luftwaffe's last miracles of engineering sat abandoned on runways. Some were destroyed by their own crews. Others were captured intact by American and British units, trophies of a future that had arrived too early. But those captured machines posed a new question. If the war had continued, if fuel had flowed, if pilots had been trained, if production had survived, would speed alone have reshaped the outcome? The answer lay not in the machines themselves, but in what happened once the guns fell silent. When the shooting stopped in May 1945, the world stepped into the wreckage of the Luftwaffe's final gamble, and found machines that looked as though they had come from another century. Jet fighters abandoned on runways. Rocket interceptors split open in silent hangars. Piston aircraft with shapes no Allied engineer had ever conceived. To the victors, these machines were more than trophies. They were questions, they were warnings, and they were blueprints for the future. Counting the cost and the claims. In the calm after the storm, the first task was simple: understand what these machines had actually achieved. Combat reports were gathered, Test pilots examined wreckage. Intelligence officers compiled numbers. And what they found revealed a truth buried beneath wartime myth and propaganda: the Me-163 Comet, a rocket without victory for all its incredible speed. The Comet's real combat record was astonishingly small. Of the hundreds built, only a fraction ever flew in operational missions. Its confirmed kills were very few, far fewer than wartime rumors suggested. Fuel explosions, landing accidents, and interception losses far outnumbered the victories it claimed. In effect, the Comet had been a technological marvel but a military failure. It was proof that speed alone could not win a war, not when that speed lasted for only minutes and was tied to a machine that killed as many of its own pilots as it did enemies. The Me-262 Schwalbe, the jet that arrived too late. The Me-262, however, told a different story. Its impact had been real and measurable. Across its operational life, the jet destroyed hundreds of Allied aircraft, primarily bombers, and forced the U.S. 8th Air Force to adapt its tactics. Escort fighters created new patrol patterns, roving airfields and attacking jets on takeoff and landing. Bomber formations tightened their defenses, yet when historians tallied the numbers, they found that the jet's effect on the wider war was limited. Engine failures, fuel shortages, bombing raids, and lack of trained pilots meant that the Me-262 never fought in the numbers required to shift the balance. Still, it was the only one of Germany's fastest aircraft that left a genuine mark on the air war. The only one that demonstrated that extreme speed could be both effective and sustainable in combat. The Do-335, the piston king with no battlefield. Dornier Do 335, meanwhile, was perhaps the most tragic of all. In tests, Allied pilots discovered that the file was every bit as remarkable as German engineers claimed. It was faster than any piston fighter they had ever encountered, with superb acceleration and surprisingly graceful handling for such a large aircraft. Yet its combat record was nearly non-existent. It had entered the war too late to shape it, a masterpiece with no canvas. A king without a kingdom. The quiet verdict forms as Allied engineers disassembled these revolutionary machines. A quiet consensus began to emerge, not about which aircraft was numerically fastest, but about which one truly represented the future. The Me-163 had shattered records, but at the cost of practicality and safety. The Do-335 had pushed piston technology to its limit, but pistons themselves were becoming obsolete. The Me-262, however, had balanced raw speed with operational viability. It had fought, it had destroyed aircraft, and it had proven that jets were not just possible, they were necessary. In hangars across Germany, Allied officers studying the captured jets realized they were looking at the end of one era and the birth of another. Yet this understanding, this recognition of the true king of speed, was only the first step. The real answer would emerge in what happened next, when the victors brought these machines home, took them apart bolt by bolt, and used their lessons to build the next generation of fighters. When Allied engineers shipped the captured German aircraft back to Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, they weren't just transporting machines, they were carrying the seeds of a technological revolution. What they discovered inside those airframes would shape the next 20 years of aviation, redefine military doctrine, and ultimately answer the question of who the true king of speed really was. Legacy. The bloodline of speed. The jet blueprint takes root for engineers at Wright Field in the United States. The Me-262 was a revelation. Its swept wing roots, tricycle landing gear, engine placement, and aerodynamic philosophy were so advanced that they immediately influenced American jet projects. The Bell P-59 had been an early experiment, but it was the Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, the first truly successful U.S. jet fighter, that absorbed the lessons of the Me-262 most directly. American test pilots noted the German jet's stability at high speeds, its ability to maintain control in dives that piston aircraft struggled to survive, and its smooth thrust delivery. These characteristics became foundational to early Cold War fighters. In Britain, the Me-262 and other captured jets accelerated the development of the Gloucester, Meteor, and later the de Havilland Vampire. While the Soviets used captured examples to guide the creation of early designs that would eventually evolve into the MiG series, the world had entered a new era, an age that Germany had glimpsed first, but could not fully grasp. The rocket that led nowhere, the Me-163's technology, however, traveled a very different path. Allied scientists studied its rocket engine with fascination, but quickly recognized its fatal flaws. The volatile fuels, the short endurance, the extreme landing hazards, none of these suited the emerging vision of air combat in the missile age. The rocket interceptor concept died with the war. Never again would any nation attempt to build a frontline rocket fighter. The Comet remained an evolutionary dead end, a brilliant but dangerous experiment that had pushed physics too far. Too fast. The last breath of the piston era, surprisingly. The Dornier Do 335 left a deeper imprint than the Comet, although pistons were already becoming obsolete. The Do 335 proved how far the old technology had come. Its push-pull configuration fascinated Allied engineers, demonstrating that high-speed twin-engine fighters could be built without the drag penalties that plagued earlier designs. But even as the file earned admiration, it became clear that piston aircraft had reached their limit. Jets could climb faster, fly farther, and achieve speeds that no propeller could match without tearing itself apart. The age of the piston fighter, an age that had begun with fabric-covered biplanes 30 years earlier, ended quietly in those post-war hangars, choosing the real king of speed with the data collected, the tests completed, and the war behind them. Allied analysts reached an unspoken consensus. The Me-163 was the fastest aircraft of World War II, but not a fighter in the true sense. The Do-335 was the fastest piston fighter ever fielded, but had no chance to prove itself. The Me-262 was the fastest operational combat fighter that shaped battles, influenced strategy, and defined the future. The Me-262 was the only aircraft whose speed translated into real, meaningful combat impact. It altered bomber tactics, demanded new escort strategies, and forced every major power to rethink its aviation doctrine. It was not just fast, it was effective. And so, in the quiet months after the war, as Allied engineers dismantled the last of the captured jets and pored over their findings, the verdict became clear. The Me-262 was the real king of speed, not by pure velocity, but by being the only machine fast enough to change the war around it. The legacy of that speed would echo far beyond 1945. Every jet fighter that followed, from the Shooting Star to the Sabre to the MiG-15, carried within it the aerodynamic DNA first, proven in combat by the Me-262. And as the world stepped into the Cold War, the question of speed would transform from wartime necessity into a defining measure of global power. The war had ended, but the race had only just begun. In the stillness that followed the war, the wreckage of speed lay scattered across Europe. Jet engines that once screamed with fire now rested cold in hangars. Rocket interceptors hung silently from museum rafters, their lethal fuels long vanished. Piston fighters, elegant, powerful, perfected to their limits, sat alongside them like relics from another world. And yet, even in silence, these machines still spoke. They whispered of an age when nations believed that faster flight might change destiny. When pilots climbed into aircraft that the human body could barely endure. When engineers pushed metal and engines beyond anything their predecessors imagined. Speed, in the Second World War, was more than motion. It was fear. It was hope. It was the final frontier between survival and oblivion. The Me-163 showed that raw velocity alone could not win a sky. The Do-335 revealed how far human ingenuity could push the old world of pistons. But the Me-262, the first true jet fighter to wage sustained combat, demonstrated something deeper, that the future belongs not to the fastest machine, but to the one whose speed can endure, adapt, and shape the battlefield around it. In the decades that followed, every fighter jet, every sonic boom, every swept wing, every engine glowing white-hot at altitude, carried a faint echo of those last, desperate months of 1945, an echo of the moment when speed leapt forward a generation, even as the regime that spawned it collapsed into darkness. Today, in museums where these machines rest beneath dim lights, children press their hands to the glass and stare upward. They see rivets, wings, engines, and something else. A question that will never fully fade. How fast is fast enough? In war, the answer is always the same. Fast enough to survive. Fast enough to return home. Fast enough to shape tomorrow. And for one brief moment in history, the skies of the Second World War held machines that reached beyond the limits of their age, each racing not only toward the enemy, but toward the future itself. If you want more untold stories of the machines and men who shaped history, join us. Subscribe and return to the battlefield with every episode.